So Isaac Babel said, if the world could write, it would write like Tolstoy. And if you've ever read any Tolstoy, you feel that quote. So who is Leo Tolstoy and why do I want to talk about him? Why is he important? Yes, he's a Russian novelist from the 1800s, but he's one of the greatest minds to ever exist. Went from an orphan to an artillery officer, teacher, opened up a bunch of schools, studied pedagogy. The study of pedagogy is the practice of teaching. He's one of the greatest novelists to ever exist. War and Peace, considered typically the best novel ever made. Anna Karenina, some of the best short stories ever made, Death of Ivan Ilyich and Haji Morat. And then even towards the end of his life, a world-renowned spiritual teacher, one that influenced Gandhi. So this video for me is to expose people to this beautiful mind of Leo Tolstoy and these beautiful novels and everything that he accomplished. Also, it's just kind of a passion project for me because Tolstoy, to me, is one of the best people to ever live. One of his biographies, by Henry Troyat, one of the best books I've ever read, and did not want to put it down. It's so interesting. His life is so interesting. The life before Tolstoy was even born played a big part in him creating War and Peace. Essentially, he went through and he read all the journals and diaries and all the drama of his family leading up to his birth. His grandpa, on his mother's side, owned the estate Yasnaya Polyana. Prince Nicholas Sergeyevich Volkonsky was a famous military officer. In the 1800s, though, he wanted to leave the military and he settled at Yasnaya Polyana, where Tolstoy later spent the most of his life. His grandpa moved there, retired, and had wanted nothing to do with the world. And Prince Volkonsky was on record saying that he needed nobody and nothing, and that anyone who wanted to see him could make the trip to his estate, which was only 130 miles from Moscow. Most of his time was spent educating his daughter, Maria. So all this sounds very, very familiar to War and Peace, obviously. So both Prince Bolkonsky and Maria Bolkonsky, even Maria, which is Tolstoy's mother, exactly the same as Maria Bolkonsky in War and Peace. She was considered ugly, didn't have any suitors. Just all around a pretty sad story, especially with her father, Prince Volkonsky, was very overbearing on her. And so she remained unmarried, had no suitors till 1821. She wrote about ending her life, but then her dad died. She found herself alone in the world. She was 31 years old. In steps Tolstoy's dad, Count Nicholas Ilyich Tolstoy. But he was not overjoyed with the prospect of marrying Maria. It was said that she was dismayingly homely, and she was 5 years older than him. Ultimately, what ended up him marrying her was that she was very rich. Rostov, the character in War and Peace, is essentially Tolstoy's dad. Maria, at the age of 38, found herself a mother of 4, Leo Tolstoy being one of them. She was pregnant with a daughter. She gave birth afterwards, so she passed away from a fever. Leo Tolstoy being only about 2 years old. Leo Tolstoy was 9. His father dropped dead in the middle of the street. 5 Tolstoy children, orphans. Luckily, though, they were adopted by Aunt Toinette. Became a staple all throughout Tolstoy's life. As Tolstoy grew up, he studied Oriental languages at University of Kazan. He transferred to law program, had bad grades in both, and then ultimately just dropped out of school. During this period in his life, so he was just lost, right? He didn't know what he wanted. Drinking, he was gambling. He lost his virginity in a brothel because his brothers took him in there. Pretty much cried with the prostitute. Orphaned life and just kind of searching and didn't know what he wanted to do. He'd keep a lot of journals, though. He made a lot of promises to himself. He's very much inspired by the 13 virtues of Benjamin Franklin. He always created like endless amount of rules that he needed to live by, and rarely did he ever live by them. One of them is in bed by 10, up by 5 a.m., no more than a 2-hour nap, limit the brothel visits just to 2 a month, limit his gambling, which gambling became a big part of his life and a crutch for a really long time. But all around, he was very artsy, very literature, very emotional kid. His brothers called him Leo Crybaby. Read and he journaled, and he was very emotional. And some of his favorite writers of the time were Lawrence Stern, Jean-Jacques Rousseau, Charles Dickens. He influenced a lot of writers as well, so definitely becoming part of the canon of literature. Got James Joyce, Virginia Woolf. She declared him the greatest novelist ever. Got Nabokov, Chekhov, who was a good friend of Tolstoy. You got Proust. Faulkner sung him all kinds of praises. So after aimlessly wandering, though, his brother convinced him to join the military. He was a beginning junker in the Caucasus, which was a war in Russia. Transferred to the Ukraine. All this was in 1854. Fought in the Crimean War in the summer of 1855. The end of the war, it coincided with Tolstoy's 27th birthday. He immediately knew a military life was not for him. The whole time, though, he was writing his childhood. So that trilogy was really big. He was writing this while he was in the military and then got it published while in the military. He went back to Yeltsana Polyana and just wanted to live a simple life. He actually stopped doing literature. He opened up 13 schools around his Yeltsana Polyana for all peasant serf children. And he taught at those schools. And so he was very giving. He studied pedagogy, so how to teach. And so that was his life purpose. And that's what he thought it was. And he actually stopped doing literature. And he thought he was just a teacher. He didn't start literature back up until after a couple exercises with some peasant serf children, having them write, he realized how simple and how beautiful these kids were writing and how there was some kind of universal truth in that. And that's what kind of motivated him to start writing again. He was friends initially turned enemies with the famous writer Turgenev, who wrote Fathers and Sons. They lived together for a while. He would poke Turgenev and try to piss him off because he liked those kind of arguments. Turgenev even said he'd punch him in the snout. Tolstoy even challenged him to a duel, and they were gonna shoot each other. Actually, they backed out, and so it never actually happened. Starting out his life, kind of like a soul-searching purpose, constantly tried to improve it. And he dedicated his life to that. Not only fluent in English, he was fluent in French, German, obviously Russian. He read in Greek, Latin, Spanish, Italian, Ukrainian, Turkish, Bulgarian. His library in his house consisted of 23,000 books in 39 different languages. By the year 1862, Tolstoy turned 34, and that's when he got married to the 18-year-old Sophia Behrs. That's the same year that he started writing War and Peace, considered by most the best novel ever written. Fun fact, Tolstoy was actually courting Sophia's sister. Sophia, in her kind of manipulating way, worked her way in, and instead of Tolstoy proposing to her sister, Tolstoy ended up proposing to Sophia. Natasha in War and Peace is actually based on Sophia's sister, Tanya. While Tolstoy wrote War and Peace, there's no way he would have been able to finish it and develop it the way that he did without Sophia's help. She wrote out each version of War and Peace by hand. She was trying to decipher his handwritten draft. She had to use a magnifying glass to figure out what he was even writing. It took them both 7 years to write War and Peace, and she rewrote the complete manuscript 8 times. I don't know if you've ever looked at War and Peace or ever read it. Well over 1,200 pages. That is a lot. She gave birth to 4 kids in the process of them writing War and Peace. She also took over all of Tolstoy's management of their estate, so that way he could focus on literature. So she literally took care of everything and just let him work on his novels. War and Peace, my personally favorite novel ever written. Amazing. If you haven't read it, read it. Was published in 1867. Immediately became world-renowned, obviously recognized as one of the best novels ever written almost immediately. Still to this day, is almost immediately after publishing War and Peace, Tolstoy had like a spiritual crisis. He called it the night at Arizamas. Very much like the character and the death of Ivan Ilyich, only Tolstoy wasn't dying. He was at the epitome of his life. He was making a lot of money. He was a world-renowned author. Essentially, he was traveling. He was struck with this terror, and he didn't know why. And it was this like spiritual crisis of what's the purpose of living, doing anything when you're going to die. And around the same time, a lot of people in his life were passing away. He lost his brother to tuberculosis. He started reading all the philosophy books started rereading all the religious texts, and he was just searching for some purpose and meaning in his life. By this time, he was writing Anna Karenina, a process that he didn't really enjoy, and he didn't even really like writing Anna Karenina. Still a great, amazing book. That's one of my top favorite books as well. Read that if you haven't. Long story short, after having a spiritual crisis, he reread all the religious texts and he kind of rediscovered Christianity, and that's kind of what pulled him out of that kind of slump in his life, where he was pretty much suicidal and was hiding ropes and stuff from himself so that way he wouldn't kill himself. This kind of new faith, new Christianity for him was very much rooted in it. It was a pacifist Christian anarchism, and he really just advocated living morally, physically, aesthetic lifestyle. He wrote many spiritual books, kind of what he did the rest of his life. He just wrote philosophical, spiritual books on how to just live and be a good person. He became a vegetarian, and one of the books that he wrote was The Kingdom of God is Within You, and that's what Mahatma Gandhi read and essentially became a follower of Tolstoy. And this is where Gandhi kind of developed his peaceful, non-resistant to evil and no violence. A whole cult kind of formed around Tolstoy. He really didn't like it. He just missed them, but they were called the Tolstoyans, and they lived there. They opened up colonies, lived and believed what Tolstoy was teaching. A lot of people would come to visit him, including Chekhov, and so Chekhov would regularly come visit Tolstoy. And Chekhov had a disagreement about Shakespeare. Tolstoy hated Shakespeare, Chekhov loved Shakespeare. Chekhov said to Tolstoy as a joke that he was intimidated by Shakespeare's genius. In 1901 and 1906, Tolstoy was nominated for the Nobel Prize in Literature, but lost, despite the many people thinking that he should have won. And the reason is there was a lot of tension between Sweden and Russia, and that's why they think that's why he lost. Ultimately in his life, he decided that the best way to live was in poverty. So he actually gave all his inheritance away, disowned everything, and essentially had nothing to his name. He still lived on Yasnaya Polyana, it's just he handed it all over to his wife. His wife owned everything. In 1910, Tolstoy was very unhappy in his marriage, and him and his wife had a lot of disagreements as far as the money and his wealth and what he should be doing with his time. He wanted to go live in a monastery and be by himself, fled his family home, turned up at a railway station. A few days later, developed pneumonia, and then that's when he passed away. Passed away on November 10th, 1910. His last words before he died, his son, and it was, "The truth. I care very much about the truth." Some beautiful quotes Tolstoy said or wrote. "The two most powerful warriors are patience and time. It is all God's will. You can die in your sleep, and God can spare you in battle. God is the same everywhere. There is no greatness where there is not simplicity, goodness, and truth. Yes, love, but not the love that loves for something, to gain something, or because of something, but that love that I felt for the first time when dying. I saw my enemy and yet loved him. If we admit that human life can be ruled by reason, then all possibilities of life is destroyed. Everyone thinks of changing the world, but no one thinks of changing himself. A man is like a fraction whose numerator is what he is, and whose denominator is what he thinks of himself. The larger the denominator, the smaller the fraction. Wrong does not cease to be wrong because the majority share in it. These are the moments of happiness, love, and be loved. That is the only reality in this world. All else is folly. If you make it a habit not to blame others, you will feel the growth of the ability to love in your soul, and you will see the growth of goodness in your life. Free thinkers are those who are willing to use their minds without prejudice, without fearing to understand things that clash with their own customs, privileges, or beliefs. This state of mind is not common, but is essential for right thinking. It is amazing how complete is the delusion that beauty is goodness.